Howdy everyone, I'm Norman Wildberger, mathematician turned banker. And today we're going to talk about a very dark time from around 1873 to about 1879, but extending actually beyond that in many countries, a major depression essentially worldwide. Now this really did happen, and it really shook up our country along with many others. So I want to tell you about that, and I want to tell you how the Little Cactus Bank sort of navigated through these very considerable challenges. So this is sometimes called the Long Depression. It used to be called the Great Depression because it was a very significant one. And until the Great Depression of the 1930s, it was the Great Depression, and now it's sometimes called the Long Depression because it lasted a long time. It is perhaps the first really international depression. It involved a lot of European countries as well as America and other countries too. So it was perhaps centered around Austria-Hungary. There was a big empire there centered at Vienna. Germany was involved, England was hit, France was hit, many other countries, and of course the US also. So it was characterized by high unemployment in many areas, a lot of bank failures, a lot of business collapses, general deflation for quite a long time. Asset prices just kept on going down, commodity prices also. So it was a very difficult time, and I want to tell you a little bit about it. Now, after a crash has come and gone, it's often easy to look back and say, well, in retrospect, it happened because of this and because of this. But often there are multiple factors that kind of coalesce at a given time to really cause the big hit. And sometimes it's not so easy to actually identify, one particular cause. It can be a wide variety of things. But almost invariably, prior rapid expansion and speculation and debt increase are contributing factors. And that was certainly the case here. So in the years before 1873, in the 1860s and early 1870s, there was a great amount of economic expansion around the world, primarily as a result of new technologies. Technologies like steamships. The Industrial Revolution had really gotten going. There were all kinds of factories, ports, and primarily railroads, as we've already talked about. So railroads were the kind of killer technology, and everybody was very excited about their possibility, and also in Europe, not just in America and other places. So there was massive investment in railroads and corresponding real estate in the areas that the railroads opened up, and speculation blew up prices to perhaps ultimately unsustainable levels. And when something gets to be an unsustainable level, there's usually a crash waiting around the corner. But when it actually comes is hard to say. During the buildup, people are thinking, well, this is not a speculative bubble, this is a new paradigm. We're engaged in a new era. The rules have changed. We are being driven by fundamentals because of this new technology. So people think that way, and then there's the collapse, and then they realize, I guess we were overextended. Okay, another cause at that time, which is a little bit harder for moderns to understand, is the shift from bimetallism to gold. So prior to this, both gold and silver were the essential core currencies upon which the monetary systems were based. And most countries adopted a kind of dual aspect. You could either pay in gold or you could pay in silver, and the relationship between these two things was quite pegged down. But around this time, there was a movement towards just gold, to abandoning the silver, so not two metals on an equal standing, but rather gold elevated above silver. And this was one of the causes of this crash. And in fact, it affected the western areas where we were very strongly because there was a lot of silver mining going on. So there was a lot of investment in silver. And so the collapse of the silver was really a contributing factor in Little Cactus, in the area around there. Another related to this one here is the buildup of credit and debt. So a lot of the expansion and development that we saw was on borrowed money. People borrowed money, they took on credit, they took on debt in order to invest in these up and coming industries. So while the first sort of wave of increase of values is no doubt supported primarily by the rich possibilities of this new technology, as the ascent keeps going up and prices get bigger and bigger, and people are making money just by owning or being part of this ascending asset bubble, then it becomes attractive to invest in it just for this escalation which is happening, which ultimately starts assuming a kind of inevitable nature. Okay? So the fundamentals drive the thing at first, and then after a while speculation takes over. And it's very hard to separate when those two things disconnect. So there definitely was a lot of that, credit and debt. There were also some recoveries from wars that were affected. There was the Civil War in the US, there was the Franco-Prussian War in Europe, and that had an effect. And then this demonetization of silver, where people started moving towards the gold standard, and that had all kinds of very important ramifications in the monetary system. So these are kinds of explanations that we can ascribe to the situation, especially in retrospect. But maybe another explanation is just that a bubble popped. Asset prices just got out of control, and eventually, boom, it popped. And finding the exact trigger for it is maybe pointless. The real reason why bubbles pop is typically because they get too big, and they're no longer really sustained by underlying fundamentals. So a little bit more specific background. So just prior to the crash in the US, of course 1861 to 1865, there was a Civil War. And then after that, and during the latter part, greenbacks were introduced, which were actually no longer connected so directly to gold or silver. And so they had maybe an inflationary aspect. There was massive expansion, which we've already talked about, railroads, real estate, and many other things. So that was one thing. And then in Europe, well, in 1870, there was a Franco-Prussian War, which the Germans won. There was massive repayments. The French had to pay lots of money to Germany. So there was a kind of a boom in the German-speaking countries, massive investment and speculation. The Europeans were really the economic center of the world at that time, and it was they that promoted a lot of the development in the US and other places in terms of funding railroad expansions and other expansions. So they invested quite heavily in various things around the world. And when that collapsed, then, well, all those other things suffered. So in 1871, the German government decided to withdraw the silver thaler coinage. So this was a thaler, dollar, German dollar. And they decided to abandon that and go to a gold standard. That was very significant. And then in 1873, there was a stock market crash in Vienna, the center of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So there'd been a big run-up in stocks and valuations, and that crashed. And then that had ripple effects that spread throughout the world, even into the US. So in the US, things came to a head in 1873 in the autumn. September, Cooke collapsed. So Cooke was a very prominent banking corporation that had been important in the Civil War in terms of funding the Union War movement, connected with bond issues. And then they also invested very heavily in railroads. And in fact, the Northern Pacific Railroad, which they invested heavily in, it was untenable, so that went down, and Cooke went down. And that was a really momentous occasion in New York. There was massive panic, and a lot of things end up collapsing as a result of that. One of the things that happened is there was a Coinage Act in 1873 that was also a contributing factor to the difficulties, where the US decided to abandon bimetallism and move to a gold standard. So the same kind of things that the Germans were doing. And that meant that the price of silver ultimately nosedived, because silver now was no longer going to be on a par with gold. So that was very calamitous to all the silver miners out west. And in fact, to a lot of ordinary people, because actually silver was more widely used as a currency than gold, because gold is too expensive. Okay, so for everyday usage, silver was more used. And so to have that removed, well, that was very destabilizing. It was actually caused actually an effective constriction of the money supply. So as a result of all of this, well, they had multiple bank failures. Should be an L here. Stock market was closed for 10 whole days. Give you a sense of the seriousness of the situation. Railroads failed, about 55 railroads failed. There were a lot of factory closures, commercial bankruptcies, and massive unemployment. At the height, probably 1 in 4 workers in New York were unemployed. So massive losses across the board. And unfortunately, it wasn't just a 1 year or 2 year thing. It was a long depression. It lasted in the US about 5 years, 5 or 6 years. And in Europe, it arguably lasted longer. There was almost a 20-year period in England, for example, where things didn't really improve. And there were further crashes. So it was the start of a long decline in a lot of places. Not just short and sharp, not just a V kind of recovery. It was a very serious long-term destabilization and caused a lot of pain and suffering across the board. So how did the U.S. respond? Well, Congress proposed a massive influx of currency to support the financial system. They proposed that they printed $500 million worth of greenbacks. And this was real printing of money. So they really proposed to print $500 million worth of greenbacks and issue them to various banks and such, and also to the National Bank to support its activities. And back then, to give you a sense of how much money that was, in 1873, $100 roughly had the purchasing power of about $2,100 in 2020. So we're talking about a factor of about 20 in terms of the relative values of these things. So this 500 million, if we multiply, say, by 20, we multiply by 2, we get a billion. Then we multiply by 10, we get to 10 billion. So that was $10 billion sort of in today's money. But you do have to remember that the U.S.'s population was a lot less back then. So maybe there were around 38 million people. So, roughly 1/10 of what it is now. So to get a corresponding figure, we should multiply that 10 billion by 10, and we're talking about something comparable to maybe $100 billion in today's monies. Now, if you want to compare that perhaps to things that are happening in modern times, you do have to remember, though, that the nature of this kind of proposed injection of currency was quite different from what it is today. So today we do things electronically, and central banks can move money around just by adding or subtracting things on balance sheets. Okay, it's a kind of a magic, electronic magic. But back then we were talking more about direct money, but crucially not backed by gold. Okay, so in that sense, things have not changed that much. The proposal was, let's just create a lot of money and throw it at the problem and keep people and jobs and keep companies and banks going. But the president, who was Ulysses Grant, the great Union War general, he had a hard time. He struggled about this proposed legislation, and eventually he decided to veto it, and he did. And he was worried about the inflationary risk of this proposal to the nation's long-term credit. Okay, that was very important for him. He realized that the currency should not be debased, that this is going to debase the currency, and it's going to weaken the long-term position of the U.S.'s monetary situation. He directly feared that this would lead to a tempting solution to further problems, that in the future, whenever there was a problem, there'd just be printing of inflationary greenbacks. That was a reasonable kind of fear. And you have to remember that at that time, people were oriented to money having to be supported by gold. By throwing out money that's not supported by gold or silver, that was considered sort of against the spirit of monetary stability and integrity. So That didn't happen, and maybe that contributed to a longer depression. People argue about this. But on the other hand, maybe after the depression was over, maybe it allowed the U.S. to move forward faster and eventually become a very strong monetary nation. In fact, the leading nation of the world in the 20th century monetarily. So how did all of this affect us out in Little Cactus, far from the center of things? Well, it had an effect there too, of course. But remember that a year previously, we had already gone through a rather traumatic situation where the Copper Gully Bank collapsed and the Little Cactus Bank took over the branch in Little Cactus. So that was already an intimation that there were going to be problems. And being a bank manager, you generally have a pretty good sense of when things are overextended and when possible financial difficulties are, ahead. Bank managers are very sensitive to that. They're really smelling that out all the time. They talk to each other. So it was pretty clear to me already before the crash that there were problems, that a lot of the railroad projects were overextended. And actually I had some intimations about the weaknesses in silver that were about to come. So this all came to a head one Friday afternoon where Matt and I were in the saloon having a whiskey, and the Smith brothers came in. They were very excited because they had just received a very lucrative offer for their silver mine. So there was a big shot silver miner, his name William Wordsworth, and he owned this big sort of Western mining company, and he was interested in really solidifying his grasp on the Western silver market. He had made them a really good offer. He had come in and actually talked to me. He wanted to know what the financial situation was in Little Cactus. He wanted to know about the relationship between the bank and the silver mine. So I explained to him how the silver mine, I had agreed, we had made this very modern kind of relationship where most of their permanent employees were paid automatically through the bank. They didn't get paid in cash. They just came to me and I just augmented their accounts. So that was quite modern, so he wanted to know all about that. And he wanted to know how the prospects were in Little Cactus, and so I told him that everything was rosy and sure to get better. So anyway, he made a nice offer to the Smith brothers. And we had this get-together on that Friday afternoon. I still remember it. And I told them, guys, I think this is a good offer. Because I had an extra piece of information. This was in 1872, at the end of the year. I had a cousin, because my father's Austrian, so I have some relatives in Austria. And one of my cousins worked in Vienna in the business, the sort of stock market there. He was a kind of a broker. And he would write me letters about what was going on there. So I knew that the stock market in Vienna was probably extended. And he also stressed to me these changes that were happening in Europe with this devaluation of silver that was likely to happen. So I was kind of abreast of that, maybe more so than a lot of my colleagues where we were. And I strongly urged the Smith brothers to consider this offer very seriously. And they took my advice. Very happily, they took my advice. And they sold up. They sold up, massive payout. So they were mega rich. And they decided, we're going to go to big city, because their wives had had enough of small town living and their families wanted to, experience the big time. So they moved to big city. They got the best houses in town. They immediately fitted into the upper echelons of society there. They were loaded. And I came to their housewarming and we had a great party and I met a lot of the people in big city. And they said, Norman, you should come to big city too. Leave Matt in charge of the Little Cactus operation. Come to big city and we'll do big things. That was kind of an interesting proposal to me. And that's what I did. I talked with my family. They were keen. So we ended up moving in 1873, the end, to big city. And the idea was that I was going to be looking for a takeover. So I had gotten a taste of being a takeover guy because of my takeover of the Copper Gully Bank. And during the Depression years that started in 1873, banks folded one after the other, especially those banks that had been overextended. Okay, it didn't have strong reserve ratios. It didn't have a lot of capitalization. But I was capitalized to the max because the Smith brothers, they would have supported any project that I wanted, and they just had so much money, it was ridiculous. So I could very carefully go through the entire banking ecosystem around there and decide, what I should do. And I was looking for a bank that was going to go under, that had good value, that I could get cheap. So I remind you that banks come under pressure typically for two reasons. First of all, because of capital losses. They have big loans, maybe to railroad projects or to steamship companies or to major factories. And then these loans go bad because those outfits can't make things happen. Or they could have a run on the bank. Depositors could start getting nervous. The depositors want their money. The depositors start taking out their money, and as we've seen, typically a bank has nowhere near enough to pay for all the depositors that supposedly have deposited their money there. Okay, so that's what can happen. And in the Depression, that's exactly what happened. And it happened to dozens of banks. There were all these little banks around, and they just folded like flies. And, with the first couple, it was like a big deal. But after a few years, yet another bank is failing. It becomes rather mundane. And crucially, the prices of those banks goes down, right? When you get to the 10th bank failing in the city, by now, no one's going to want to pay a lot of money for the remnants of this bank. So if you've got some cash, which I had the Smith Brothers cash, I could get those things cheap. And I got what I think was a great deal. I ended up buying the Western Hills Transfer and Banking Company. Well, actually, we called it a merger, to make it more polite. But that's basically what happened. So the Western Hills Transfer and Banking Company was a company that specialized in moving money, moving gold, silver monies around. And so it had a couple of small offices in a wide variety of different places in the western area where we lived. And so that was kind of good. So I had a chance to travel around, and they had some stagecoaches that would routinely have these routes. And so I kind of reorganized all of that and removed a lot of the stagecoaches, went sort of to paper rather than actual physical stuff. And when I did have to move some physical stuff, I typically used the railroads. But anyway, I put a lot of effort into this. And because this was a rather biggish company, so it was several times as big as Little Cactus, I decided that I'd use the opportunity to change the name of my bank. So I incorporated the Western into the Cactus, and the new bank, which was the union of the Little Cactus Bank and this Western Hills, became the Western Cactus Bank. Has a bit more of a, solid, all-embracing aspect, don't you think? So anyway, that was kind of the next chapter of my banking career. I was in big city. I was in the middle of things there. It was the center for commerce in a very large extended region, and I had a very positive position in control of this new bank, which was going places. And I met a lot of movers and shakers, and probably I became a mover and shaker myself. And a few years later, in 1880, I was invited to become the governor of the first regional reserve bank in that area, which was another interesting chapter of my banking career, and I'll tell you all about that in my next video. I'm Norman Wildberger. Thanks for listening.